Hi, good evening, everybody. This is Dan Scott. I'm answering a question this week from Kristen Gonzalez. She asks, is it wrong for us, that is America, as a country to take advantage of our military security power and use it to our advantage? The context appears to be the threat of military force during international negotiations. And she goes on to say, yes, we want peace and less acts of terrorism, but is it justifiable to constantly use the threat of military force instead of seeking a different solution to the, quote, madness, end quote? Um, Kristen seems to be seeking the answer from a constructionist point of view. So I'll attempt to answer the constructivist question while addressing the realist perspective as well. And links to the sources will be available in the description below. All right. So in response to the second part of the question, I would ask if and why it would be any less appropriate for the United States to utilize the same diplomatic strategy that has been present throughout human history. The Greek historian Thucydides, he records an example of the threat of force in the Melian dialogues in the history of the Pelopennesian War, where Athenians came and were attempting to force the island of Melos to cede to their demands and to comply with them under threat of force. But I'd say overall the question itself is ethical in nature, less than political or scientific in that way. So we'll go with that route. I would say it can be wrong if we don't use our use our power appropriately. For example, that would be a preemptive war as opposed to a defensive war or deterrence. The purpose of government overall is to protect the state as well as its citizens, and that's nothing new. But it's also to protect national interest at home and abroad. So that begs the question of what is considered to be a national interest, which I would say goes back to the ethical question as well. Are we being reasonable in our interests, or are we seeking a hegemony of power? There are ways of measuring the efficacy of military security, things like the just war doctrine, as well as the Weinberger-Powell doctrines, all of which have clearly defined calls for military action to be the last resort. They also have clearly defined objectives and an exit strategy. So I think that's one way to go about looking at it. Looking at the world itself realistically, I think we should understand that military security is and has been a part of national security since the beginning of civilization. It's a foundational principle to alliances. Some states have greater power than others. That's just kind of a part of the world we live in. And it's been that way forever. The Bible talks about a military alliance between the kingdom of Judah and Egypt to stand up against the threat of Babylonian aggression rather. The ancient Greeks obviously united against the Persians. The Romans, they kind of had a hegemony of power for a long time, who kept any potential challengers at bay. And alliances are also vital to so-called developing countries today. We have the African Union involved in Somalia right now. NATO has provided deterrence and protection for the Baltic states in particular since the annexation of Crimea in 2014. There's been interventions by regional defense organizations in Southern and West Africa, as mentioned by Jackson on page 168 as well. So I would say, I know that last part was kind of a tangent, so I'm sorry. I'd say to answer the question directly, I would say no. It's not wrong as long as we conduct ourselves in a moral and ethical way. But I hope that answers your question. So thanks again.